People really don't understand what the climate was in Philadelphia in the years before Mumia was arrested. Because if they did, they would look at his arrest and his trial in a different fashion.
In 1982, Philadelphia journalist Mumia Abu Jamal was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of police officer Daniel Faulkner. On the July 4th weekend, he was sentenced to death. In 2001, federal court judge William Yon overturned Abu Jamal's death sentence as illegally imposed and unconstitutional. Yet Abu Jamal remained on death row for more than 10 years while the Philadelphia district attorney continued to pursue his execution. In 2011, the DA's office conceded defeat, and after 30 years on death row, Abu Jamal was transferred from solitary confinement and joined the general prison population, where he continues his appeals. Mumia Abu Jamal has said numerous times, "My only crime that night is that I survived." In fact, the effort to legally execute Abu Jamal has only recently ended, but the first attempt to kill him may have been made on that fateful night of December 9, 1981. Abu Jamal was also critically wounded, shot through the chest, and found near the prone body of Daniel Faulkner. And the evidence that convicted him for the murder, well, it doesn't exist. It's been well established over the years that Abu Jamal's trial was patently unjust. For instance, the Philadelphia DA trained prosecutors to exclude blacks from juries. In Abu Jamal's case, 11 out of the 15 preemptory strikes were made to bar blacks from his jury. What this short film will document is how countless due process violations began just moments after the shooting of Daniel Faulkner and Mumia Abu Jamal, when members of the Philadelphia Police Department began to manufacture Abu Jamal's guilt and, perhaps more importantly, conceal his innocence. In the culture wars that have punted Mumia the effigy back and forth across ideological fields of politics, race, and class, the attempt has been made to diminish the relevance of Abu Jamal as a journalist in 1981. But this man, who was elected president of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, was already well known throughout the city as a fiercely independent up-and-coming journalist. In fact, by the age of 15, the FBI was tracking the young writer for the Black Panther Party through their draconian and illegal program known as COINTELPRO. Not for violent behavior, but because of his, quote, inclination to appear and speak at public gatherings. Also, in 1981, he was well known to the Philadelphia Police Department as an outspoken journalist who reported on police corruption and brutality, in particular with regard to the Philly PD's hostile relationship with the controversial MOVE organization, culminating in a year-long police siege of the MOVE House that ended in 1978 with the shooting death of police officer James Ramp. 9 members of MOVE were charged with the murder, and during his coverage of the trial, Abu Jamal strongly criticized the actions of the police and the prosecution, including the implication that the officer was most likely killed by police crossfire. The MOVE trial concluded just a year and a half before Abu Jamal and Faulkner were found shot on that fateful night. And it was only 4 months from the federal trial of MOVE leader John Africa, whose acquittal on gun charges left the police and DA's office infuriated.
When they saw who they had, that was number one. I mean, wow, you know, look what we done ran into. We got a Panther, and we're gonna kill this Panther. We're gonna kill this nigga here, right here.
In the early morning hours of December 9, 1981, police officer Daniel Faulkner pulls over a rundown blue Volkswagen Beetle in the bustling red light district of Philadelphia. At 3:51 a.m., Faulkner reports over his radio that he has stopped the car at 13th and Locust Street. At the same time, Mumia Abu Jamal is parked in his cab just around the corner. He fills out his log anticipating a new fare just as the clubs are closing. He's moonlighting as a cab driver after his uncompromising approach to reporting began to cost him work as a journalist. He had recently started carrying a registered .38 Charter Arms revolver during his late-night cab runs after having recently been robbed at gunpoint. From the DA's office to Abu Jamal's most ardent defenders, all agree that Abu Jamal's brother Billy Cook, who ran a street vendor stall nearby, exited his Volkswagen and had an exchange with Faulkner. But what happened next has been the subject of heated debate ever since. What is certain is that the version put forth by the prosecution in conjunction with the Philadelphia Police Department at Abu Jamal's 1982 trial is a complete fabrication, and a willful fabrication at that. After being denied his constitutional right to defend himself at his original trial, and after heeding legal advice not to testify at his appeals hearing in 1995, Abu Jamal released a declaration in 2001 in which he details the events of that night.
I did not shoot police officer Daniel Faulkner. I had nothing to do with the killing of Officer Faulkner. I am innocent. I was filling out my log when I heard some shouting. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a flashing dome light of a police cruiser. This wasn't unusual. I continued to fill out my trip sheet when I heard what sounded like gunshots. I looked again into my rearview mirror and saw people running up and down Locust. I recognized my brother standing in the street, staggering and dizzy. I immediately exited the cab and ran to his screen. As I came across the street, I saw a uniformed cop turn toward me, gun in hand. Saw a flash and went down to my knees.
Now, the prosecution claimed that Abu Jamal's brother, Billy Cook, was alone in the Volkswagen. Officers James Forbes and Robert Shoemaker testified at the '82 trial that they were the first officers to arrive on the scene and that they immediately found Abu Jamal's gun as well as Faulkner's gun. Inspector Alfonso Giordano would arrive 3 minutes later and take control of the scene as the ranking officer. At pre-trial hearings, Giordano testified that Abu Jamal confessed to the murder when Giordano asked him where his gun was, and Abu Jamal replied, "I dropped it beside the car after I shot him." Cab driver Robert Chobert testified he was parked just behind Faulkner's squad car, witnessed the shooting, and identified Abu Jamal as the shooter. Prostitute Cynthia White also testified that she saw the shooting. Her testimony matched that of Robert Chobert's. All of these claims, most of which form the foundation of the prosecution's case, were manufactured. Let's first look at the claim that Billy Cook was alone in the Volkswagen. After Faulkner radioed that he stopped a car, he followed with, quote, "On second thought, send me a wagon." This request for backup clearly indicates that there was more than one person in the car. Then in 1995, Captain Edward D'Amato admitted that a driver's license permit for a man named Arnold Howard, a business partner of Cook's, was found on Faulkner. Again, strong evidence that there was more than one person in Billy Cook's Volkswagen. In 1982, the police and prosecution illegally kept this evidence from Abu Jamal and his defense attorney. Why were they suppressing this evidence of other potential suspects in the shooting of Daniel Faulkner? Now, what about the immediate recovery of the weapons? Radio transmissions from the scene to Central Command over the next 15 minutes contradict the testimony of Officers Forbes and Shoemaker. No officer reports immediately finding any weapons. In fact, nearly 5 minutes later, officers on the scene report that Faulkner's gun is missing. It was 14 minutes before it was reported that the suspect's gun was recovered and that they had the doer in custody. There is no report that Abu Jamal confessed. There is no report that a witness or witnesses identified anyone as the shooter. Prior to the arrival of the police mobile forensics unit, freelance photographer Pedro Polikoff arrived, moving freely through the crime scene and snapping off more than 24 photos. These photos show, contrary to police regulations, that the area was not properly secured to preserve evidence. The photographs also show Officer Forbes walking around carrying both guns in his bare hand. This lack of regard for forensic evidence looks more like willful intent to manipulate a crime scene when you consider the following. Police reported no fingerprints on the guns. No tests were done on Abu Jamal's hands for gunpowder residue. Contrary to police regulations, Officer Forbes failed to immediately turn over the weapons to the mobile crime unit. In fact, the weapons were not turned over for 2 hours. Later, the police falsely described the bullet from Faulkner's head wound as too damaged and deteriorated to do a comparison ballistics test with a bullet fired from Abu Jamal's gun. But photographs of the bullet clearly show the identifying characteristics, its twists, the number of lands and grooves, and the relative widths. Instead, the prosecution claimed that the bullet was, quote, consistent with one fired from Abu Jamal's Charter Arms .38 revolver, although police ballistics expert Anthony Paul admitted this is true of, quote, multiple millions of guns. During appeals, when Abu Jamal and his legal team demanded independent testing to determine if the bullet was fired from Abu Jamal's gun, their request was denied, first by Judge Albert Sabo, and then later by federal court judge William Yawn. What all of this clearly illustrates is that, in fact, there is no physical evidence that Abu Jamal shot Faulkner, or that his gun was the murder weapon. But what about eyewitness testimony? What about Cynthia White, the prostitute whose testimony was the linchpin to the prosecution's case? Several times after the shooting, she was arrested only to be let go after she signed updated witness statements. Each time, the story changed to make a stronger case against Abu Jamal. By the time the case went to trial, her statement fit perfectly into the prosecution's case. Witnesses Pamela Jenkins and Yvette Williams swore that White said she was scared for her life under police threats if she didn't testify as they wanted. Witness Veronica Jones blurted out on the witness stand at the 1982 trial that the police told her Cynthia White was given a deal to say that Abu Jamal was the shooter. Jones testified that the police threatened her to ID Abu Jamal as well. What's more, all the civilian witnesses, both for the prosecution and the defense, testified that they didn't see Cynthia White on the scene, or only later after the police arrived. And what about eyewitness Robert Chobert? His testimony was arranged most likely by Inspector Alfonso Giordano. The official police photos, as well as Polikoff's photos, show Chobert's cab was not parked behind Faulkner's squad car as claimed by Chobert and the prosecution. In fact, Chobert was driving illegally that night on a suspended license while on probation after being paid to throw a firebomb into a grade school. During appeals, Chobert admitted that in exchange for his testimony, the prosecution said they would assist with his probation. What's more, Chobert later admitted that he was parked elsewhere and that his testimony was false. The prosecution offered two more eyewitnesses, Michael Scanlon and Albert Magilton. Both men said that they did not see the shooting. Magilton only saw a man run across Locust Street. Scanlon explicitly described the man he saw as having an afro hairstyle and not dreadlocks. There are yet more troubling questions about what happened that night. Questions that continually underscore the innocence of Abu Jamal as well as the effort to frame him. 6 witnesses, including Robert Chobert, made statements that one or more people fled the scene. There is no evidence that investigators ever pursued this person or persons, and, according to these witnesses, they were subjected to police threats, coercion, or offered favors by the prosecution. William Singletary, a local businessman, said he was standing on a nearby street corner and witnessed the shootings. Immediately after, he tried to give his statement to police that Abu Jamal arrived after Faulkner was already shot. Homicide detectives interrogated and threatened Singletary with bodily harm as well as the trashing of his business if he testified in favor of Abu Jamal. And then Abu Jamal's brother, Billy Cook, later swore that his business partner, Ken Freeman, was in the car with him and participated in the shooting of Faulkner. Cook said police threatened him with his life and that he too would be charged with Faulkner's murder if he testified for his brother at trial. Also factor in that 8 people, including 2 officers and 2 prosecution witnesses, identified the shooter or persons near Faulkner as wearing a green army jacket. But Billy Cook was wearing a blue Nehru-style jacket, and Abu Jamal was wearing a blue quilted ski jacket with wide red zigzag stripes. In 1999, a career criminal and self-described hitman Arnold Beverly confessed he shot Faulkner in the head and that Abu Jamal arrived after Faulkner was shot and had nothing to do with the shooting. Without providing any reason except that the confession was too late, the Pennsylvania and federal courts have refused to even admit this confession into evidence. Now, while the prosecution supposedly had 4 witnesses to the shooting, none of their witnesses ever said they saw Abu Jamal get shot. The prosecution argued that as Abu Jamal came across Locust Street, he shot Faulkner in the back, and as Faulkner turned and was falling down, he pulled his gun and shot Abu Jamal. An upward shot through his chest. While the prosecution tried to explain the clear downward trajectory of the bullet as a ricochet off his ribcage, medical evidence is clear that the bullet moved cleanly into Abu Jamal's chest, through his lung and lodged near his liver in an uninterrupted downward line. The prosecution's rendition of how Abu Jamal was shot is physically impossible. But perhaps the most striking fabrication of the case presented to jurors in 1982, a falsehood that formed the emotional foundation of the prosecution's case and its success in securing a death sentence, is the testimony of Cynthia White and Robert Chobert that Abu Jamal shot Faulkner, execution style, standing directly over him and unloading 4 rounds, somehow 3 miss and only 1 strikes Faulkner in the face. Now, what this claim actually shows is the clear intent by members of the Philadelphia Police Department and the District Attorney's Office to frame Mumia Abu Jamal for a crime he did not commit. Bullets from a .38 caliber weapon hitting the sidewalk would, without any doubt, leave divots as they tore into the concrete. As shown by this photo analyzed by Robert Nelson, an expert in photo enhancement and analysis at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the concrete was, as Nelson determined, quote, completely smooth. This photograph proves that White and Chobert could not have seen, as they claimed at trial, anyone stand over Faulkner and fire. This clearly supports, along with the other evidence of police intimidation, that their testimony was arranged to support a patently false, physically impossible rendition of the crime. This execution-style account invented by the police and prosecution was a key part of their concerted effort not only to get a guilty verdict, but the death penalty. Mumia Abu Jamal's arrest for this murder was shocking to all who knew him or knew his work. The headline of the Philadelphia Inquirer the next day was unusually sympathetic, stating, "The suspect, Jamal, an eloquent activist not afraid to raise his voice." Philadelphia Inquirer, December 10, 1981. Arrested and charged with murdering a police officer, Abu Jamal from the very outset acted on his innocence, twice requesting a police lineup, a direct challenge to prosecution witnesses to identify him. He knew the real shooter, or shooters, must have fled the scene. But the court denied his requests for a lineup, just as they would deny his request for funds that would pay for defense investigations, as well as expert ballistics witnesses. What's been presented here is evidence of a concentrated effort to frame a man who had been the object of hatred among members of the Philadelphia Police Department for more than a decade. Though it was denied by police, the admitting doctor at Jefferson Hospital, where both Abu Jamal and Faulkner were admitted, noted injuries indicating that Abu Jamal took a serious beating in addition to his critical gunshot wound. Supported by civilian witness statements, Abu Jamal himself recounts being punched, kicked, and rammed headfirst into a pole by officers arriving on the scene. After being thrown into a police van, Inspector Alfonso Giordano assaults Abu Jamal in the head with a police radio while hurling racial slurs. A former commander of the Philadelphia Police Department stakeout cops, Giordano was in charge of the raids on the offices of the Philadelphia chapter of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s, when Abu Jamal was a prominent member. Giordano was also in charge of the year-long police siege of Move in 1978, which typified racial tensions in the city at the time and resulted in the subsequent trial of the Move 9. When Giordano arrived on the crime scene to find the wounded journalist Abu Jamal, he knew exactly who he was, and from that moment on, all police attention was directed to producing evidence of Abu Jamal's guilt and nothing else. As the prosecution built their case, Giordano was the prime police witness during pretrial hearings, and his account of Abu Jamal's confession was a cornerstone. But without explanation, he was pulled from the case and did not even testify at trial. Unknown to Abu Jamal and his defense, Giordano, as well as the commander and deputy commander of the Center City area, along with the head of the homicide division, in fact, the entire chain of command in Abu Jamal's prosecution, were all under FBI investigation for corruption at the time of Faulkner's murder. Giordano was removed from his post as a command inspector and relegated to desk duty after the FBI and the Justice Department apparently informed Philadelphia District Attorney Ed Rendell that Giordano was under investigation for corruption and his testimony at Abu Jamal's trial would undermine their case. Giordano resigned from the police force at full retirement pay, the first working day after Abu Jamal's conviction. His previously publicized report that Abu Jamal confessed to shooting Faulkner was not even introduced at trial. But the prosecution would still get their confession. The DA's office convened a roundtable meeting and asked police witnesses, did anybody hear his statement? Officers Gary Bell and Gary Wakshull, along with Jefferson Hospital security guard Priscilla Durham, suddenly report a second confession by Abu Jamal. At this point, this dramatic second confession is being remembered and reported more than 2 months after the night of the crime. Officer Wakshull, assigned to Abu Jamal from the crime scene through his admittance to the hospital, along with Officer Bell and security guard Durham, reportedly heard Abu Jamal say, "I shot the motherfucker and I hope he dies." But less than 2 hours after supposedly hearing this confession, Wakshull completed his report to homicide detectives with the statement that during his entire time guarding Abu Jamal, quote, "the Negro male made no comments." When Wakshull was questioned during appeals why it took more than 2 months to report this supposed confession, he explained that he was too distressed to remember and then later claimed, quote, "I only then realized it might have some meaning." Security guard Priscilla Durham, who had aspirations to become a police officer herself, later admitted to her stepbrother that she lied about hearing this confession. And what about Dr. Anthony Coletta, who was with Abu Jamal from the time he arrived in the emergency room until he went into surgery and stated that he did not hear nor hear of any confession made by Abu Jamal in the hospital? When Abu Jamal attempted to call Wakshull to the stand during the '82 trial to counter the report of his confession, he was told by the prosecution that the officer was on vacation and was denied even a phone call by Judge Sabo to see if the officer could be reached. When Abu Jamal protested this blatantly unreasonable and unjust denial, Sabo's response was, "Your attorney and you goofed." A comment of such cruelty is no surprise given the obvious bias and racism of Judge Sabo, who promised to a fellow judge in the presence of court reporter Terry Maurer Carter that, quote, "I'm going to help them fry the nigger." But while Sabo was infamous for his hostile behavior with defendants and was actually nicknamed the prosecutor in robes, it was a corrupt Philadelphia police force, empowered by the DA, that clearly manufactured Abu Jamal's guilt and suppressed evidence of his innocence beginning in those early morning hours of December 9th, 1981. In 1998, from the bowels of death row, Mumia Abu Jamal made this statement, a statement that reaches back into Philadelphia's unquestionably racist history and shines a bright light into the darkness.
Even after their legal legerdemain, I remain innocent. A court cannot make an innocent man guilty. Any ruling founded on injustice is not justice. The righteous fight for life, liberty, and for justice can only continue.